survey that's going. Um, Let me just check to see if I can I share now? Yes. Okay. Let me share this. Hopefully that should work. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, great. So but yes, so I've worked and most recently I've also joined the LiteBIRD collaboration. So I'm and I'm also working, I'm not part of the Simons Observatory collaboration, but we have lots of people at Manchester who work on Simons Observatory, so I'm quite aware of what's going on with that. There's also people, I've most recently started working with people doing this, the new push of radio foregrounds exploration in terms of both analysis and future experiments, specifically for foreground experiments in the south of the southern hemisphere, where we are quite limited in terms of these foreground radio foreground experiments. But anyway, the main part of this talk, the start of this talk, I just wanted to explain, sort of the motivation, or where my career has started and is going, which is using these cosmology experiments for foreground science. So let's hopefully this will change slides. Yes. Okay. So all right. So you can't have a CMB seminar without showing a picture of the CMB. So this is the CMB anisotropes as seen by the Planck satellite. But critically, it's as seen by the CMB, the Planck satellite, after all the foregrounds, all the galaxy has been removed, right? So this is seeing beyond. So normally the whole sky is basically covered, shrouded in dust clouds or synchrotron radiation that we have to remove first to be able to get this magnificent picture of the first light of the universe. But CMB experiments and cosmology experiments are great for the CMB, but why are they good for galactic science? So this is sort of the broad strokes reasons why you would want to use CMB experiments for foreground science, and some of these are quite obvious. So one of them is of course high sensitivity or low noise. CMB experiments are, of course, going after extremely faint signals. The total intensity anisotropies that you saw in the figure before are extremely faint themselves, comparable to the foregrounds, the galactic foregrounds at around 150 gigahertz. But then when you go to polarization, and you're going after E modes and B mode signals, these polarized signals from the CMB, you will have to go even deeper again. So that it requires you designing these low noise amplifiers that are extremely sensitive. So that sensitivity is also extremely useful for foreground science, because to accurately produce the map that we saw before, we have to have extremely high signal to noise measurements of the foreground components, either side of the peak in the CMB spectrum. The next point is, of course, so not just low noise. Low noise is nice, but it's no use to have low noise if you don't understand your instrument extremely well as well. So CMB missions especially have extremely tight constraints on the systematics from the instrumentation that they need to control. Most importantly with this, one of the most important, most useful for studying our own galaxy are the beams. So when you're designing a CMB experiment, you want to have a beam model that has as small of side lobes as possible. Or at least very well understood side lobes. You want to have beams that are symmetric. You want to have beams that don't have much polarization leakage from total intensity to polarization, or vice versa. And these properties are extremely useful as well for just studying galactic foregrounds as well, because it just makes it so much easier for us to disentangle all the different components if things are being measured just by a nice clean Gaussian beam. Other properties, of course, are things like correlated noise. So you can have the most high sensitivity low noise amplifiers in the world, but if they generate correlated noise, which results in stripes in your maps, then you're probably not going to be able to realize that sensitivity. That sensitivity per sample will be washed out by the fact that over long periods of time, you have structures that are imprinted into your data set from slow drifts in the overall noise and temperature of your LNAs. This is the next point on here is only really specific to space-based missions, but I've written ground pickup, but I just mean terrestrial signals. If you're in space, you have a huge benefit in that you don't have to compete with the Earth itself emitting as a black body. You don't have to compete with humans generating all the electromagnetic signals that we like to throw out all around us that we see and pick up in the radio and microwave, and even in some cases in the submillimeter. And of course, we also don't have the atmosphere, which is incredibly difficult to handle as soon as you start getting up to 30 gigahertz and higher. The phenomena that I'll go into this a little bit more. We're looking at lots of interesting continuum emission phenomena. So you've got synchrotron radiation, free radiation, anomalous microwave emission, and emission from dust grains. And finally, another reason why CMB missions are nice, especially the space ones, is that you end up with this full sky coverage, which a lot of experiments that are maybe used for galactic science, but not specifically used for CMB, they don't tend to have this large scale sky coverage. If you think of telescopes like the Green Bank telescope or the Parkes telescope, or the Effelsberg telescope, although they can map very large areas of the sky and have done in the past, in general, it's very difficult to get time because these are general use telescopes, and to map very large areas at high resolution using these large dishes is difficult. And also they aren't designed with all of these criteria mentioned before in mind in terms of beams and noise. So it just makes it much more difficult to do. So missions like Planck and WMAP and even COBE, they give us these all sky views of our galaxy that are very difficult to obtain otherwise. At the very minimum, you always need at least 2 telescopes on the Earth to be able to see the whole sky, whereas in space, you only need 1. So this is my sort of provocative slide with the question at the top. Is the CMB science the most important thing? Comes from CMB experiments, and I mean yes, the answer to that is yes. But what I want to show here, and take this graph with a bit of a pinch of salt, but I thought it was interesting to compile. So what I've done here is I've just gone through. I've used the NASA ADS API to pull out all the papers for various CMB experiments. By just searching through the titles of papers that mention these different experiments, and then looking in their abstracts to see do they talk about CMB, or do they not talk about the CMB, right? Do they mention the CMB or various CMB related words in their abstracts, and then use that to qualify here papers that are blue, which are the primary science, the primary CMB science of these missions. The orange are anything that doesn't contain any mention of CMB related keywords. And the green is the same as the orange, only I've removed any mention of Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect type mentions as well, which are technically also traces of cosmology. So if you're just interested in looking at the astrophysical or galactic science that are coming from these experiments, the green bar is the one which sort of clears out the rest of the technical and the SZ related research. And what I wanted to just highlight with this, and I know that this group is, it's thinking about, CMB missions for the India in the future. So I just wanted to, keep this in mind, is that for many of these experiments, galactic science makes up, or astrophysical science with these experiments makes up a huge chunk of their total paper output. For many experiments, Planck most notably, which I'll go into a bit more detail on the next slide, there are actually more galactic science related papers than there are CMB related papers. And I think this is really important to keep in mind, because this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You do kind of have to have people on board who are thinking about these things from the beginning of the CMB or cosmology experiment that you're running, who are thinking about, what can you use these experiments for beyond just the main science goals. And if we look at Planck, so this is going from this is all the papers published that mention Planck in their title for each year from the year it was launched, and again, blue here is showing any papers that are related directly to CMB, and then orange is showing papers that are not directly related to the CMB. And what you can see is that each year, primarily, I mean, more papers generally are released as a percentage of the number of total publications that are not actually about the CMB. And early on, if you look back here in 2010 to 2013, certainly from 2011 to 2013, in the sort of the early release, those first early release papers from Planck, the vast majority of them were to do with ancillary science, and not to do with the direct science outcome. And I think this is important because for three reasons, right? So the first one is that when you have ancillary science built in, and this was, these sort of projects were led by people within working group 7 of Planck. This ancillary science actually brought in a larger community into the Planck sphere, right? So that a large community of scientists outside of just cosmology were then interested in the project. They were like, okay, what can we learn about dust science? What can we learn about synchrotron emission? What can we learn about free emission within our galaxy? And so that brings in a larger community that can use the data. The other benefit is it actually gives you a nice trickle of papers over time. So actually, that makes sure that the impact of your CMB mission is constantly outputting things all the way from the beginning, because a CMB mission takes time to build up the sensitivity to get to the major result, the major CMB result that you need. So having ancillary science in mind, just make sure that you are constantly producing results. Keeping the impact and the visibility of your experiment high up until you release the main CMB results, or whatever cosmology result your experiment is aiming for. And of course, the other benefit is it just produces more publications overall, which is always good. You always want to keep that in mind when you're designing your, potentially billion-dollar of order $1 billion type space-based CMB mission, for example. So what do we see when we look at the sky? So this is these are the different main continuum components that we see when we were looking when we were observing the microwave and submillimeter sky, which is the sky observed by WMAP and Planck, and where I've worked most of my career is sort of in this range of frequencies and wavelengths. So the four main components that you see in total intensity are synchrotron radiation, which is this green image in the top left, which is generated by relativistic cosmic ray electrons that are spiraling in the magnetic field of the galaxy. We can see then free, the blue. This is ionized gas. So this is the ionized gas generated mostly by from OB type stars in star formation regions, which is why it's mostly constrained to the sort of the thin disk areas and some nearby star formation regions. It's not as diffuse as other components. Next, after that, we can see we also have thermal dust. So thermal dust is generated by vibrational modes of carbonaceous and silicate grains within the interstellar medium. These are based within clouds that are left over from star formation processes, and some of these, a lot of the stuff at high latitudes is very nearby. This is mostly tracing the local bubble around our sun, of order a kiloparsec away or so, and also is also associated with star formation regions, right? Because for a star to collapse, you need to have a sufficient dust column to protect it from the ionizing radiation of nearby OB type stars. So you also get this overdensity along the galactic plane, along the center of this projection. I should make that clear, actually, in case you're not totally familiar with these projections. If anyone's not, these are all sky maps. So these are all sky mole-wide projections in galactic coordinates. So the center of the galaxy is is in the middle of this plot, and it is increasing in galactic longitude to the left, and then wraps it back around. The last component here, so the orange map, anomalous microwave emission, is a bit more unusual. We know significantly less about anomalous microwave emission than we do the other three components. But what we do know is that it is very much traced or correlates very strongly with thermal dust. The leading hypothesis for what anomalous microwave emission is that it is generated by rapidly rotating small dust grains of order, tens to hundreds of nanometers in size, so just a few atoms. And the leading candidate for that type of emission comes from polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And the reason why we believe they might be the culprit behind anomalous microwave emission is for two reasons. One being that we know that polyaromatic hydrocarbons are very ubiquitous within the galaxy and other galaxies from mid-infrared line emission. And also we know that they are of the right size to be able to spin up to the tens of gigahertz required to produce the anomalous microwave emission that we see. Because this anomalous microwave emission is a peaked type emission that peaks are around 30 gigahertz. So that's total intensity. If we look in polarization, we see that we have synchrotron radiation. So we only have, the sky is somewhat simpler in terms of foregrounds when we look in polarization. We have two components mostly. We have synchrotron radiation, the same as before. So this is polarized up to about 70%. And we have thermal dust emission, which is generally polarized to around 10% or so. There's free emission is not polarized, it's just ionized gas. But there are some situations where boundary conditions can occur such that you might get some polarization, but generally it's not considered a polarized foreground. And then anomalous microwave emission, the question is still out on whether or not that is polarized. So if it's spinning dust grains, as I was talking, from polyaromatic hydrocarbons, in general, we would say no, it's not polarized. The theory says that it shouldn't be. The relaxation times of those grains to align with local magnetic fields is much longer than the time they would be for which they would generally be misaligned by turbulence within the interstellar medium. So in general, they do not align with the magnetic field of the galaxy, so they aren't polarized. But there are other models that are proposed that could be polarized, including magnetic dust emission, which is where instead of polyaromatic hydrocarbons, we actually have ferromagnetic or paramagnetic grains, which are either iron free floaters or iron inclusions within larger carbonaceous grains, which could they could align with magnetic fields much better and produce similar emission to what we see with anomalous microwave emission, but be highly polarized. That hasn't been detected yet. So as far as we know, that is not the mechanism for anomalous microwave emission. But that is actually something which I am working on currently. That's a future project that I'm working on, is searching for evidence of magnetic dust, because it is critically important for upcoming CMB missions in terms of a foreground component related, especially for these really deep missions like Simons Observatory and LiteBIRD. So this is just a bit more of a summary on what you can see when you look at magnetic fields within the galaxy, like what you're learning from polarization data. So this is on the top left here is the Planck's dust map with the angles of the polarization vector field being plotted over the top of the intensity field to show the alignment of the grains with to show the direction of the galactic magnetic field. And on the right is the CBAS equivalent, which I'll come back to later when I'm talking a bit more about CBAS. This is showing synchrotron polarized intensity with, again, the polarization vector field overplotted, but rotated to show the orientation of the galactic magnetic field. And basically what we are learning from studying these sort of emission is we're learning about the galactic magnetic field. Mostly, so when we are looking in dust and synchrotron, we're seeing just the one component. We're seeing the perpendicular component of the magnetic field. And we can combine that with things like Faraday rotation maps, which actually measure the line of sight magnetic field. So combining multiple data sets with these high quality dust, synchrotron, and Faraday rotation, we can actually start mapping things like 3D. In theory, you can start mapping the 3D structure of the galactic magnetic field. However, the details of that are complicated and nobody's fully realized that yet. And of course, from the galactic magnetic field, we can learn things about cosmic ray electrons. We can learn things about dust grain properties. Most of these structures we see in the CBAS map, we are caused by supernovae, superbubbles, potentially outflows, potentially AGN events from our own galaxy. So there's all sorts of interesting physics that we can potentially learn from looking at these polarized maps of our galaxy. So these are just some of the experiments, but I'm just going to skip ahead because we started a little bit late, so I'm just going to miss those. But I do want to talk about this. So this is intensity mapping. So this is the other part of my project, my career, sorry, is working on these intensity mapping experiments. And the reason why I've found myself working in these is actually because analysis-wise and technology-wise, intensity mapping and CMB have a lot of crossover. There is a significant crossover in the expertise in both of those domains, which makes it a perfect sort of bedfellow or synergistic science target for a lot of CMB experiments. So what you can see here on the left is a cube of CO over cosmic time. This is one of the original theory papers for COMAP, which is a CO line intensity mapping experiment that's trying to measure CO between redshifts of, well, around redshift 3, which is the period of galaxy assembly. The reason why it's like CMB is because when you use intensity mapping, you are mapping large areas, the integrated brightness of multiple galaxies. So you can see these structures, these filamentary structures. These are caused by clusters of galaxies, and we're measuring the integrated light from many galaxies. This CO, or another popular target is ionized carbon, or C2 emission. And of course, the primary, one of the leading emission targets from line intensity mapping is H1. They all do the same thing. They're all measuring this line emission from multiple galaxies within large voxels. And what you end up with is multiple anisotropic maps of that have a very similar feel to the CMB, except you instead of just having one CMB, you have a whole spectrum, a whole cube of different CMBs that you can use to analyze the evolution of gas within. So that you've got astrophysics, so it's the evolution of gas content within the over cosmic time, but also you can use it to measure the power spectrum of the matter power spectrum and go after signals like the baryonic acoustic oscillations, for example. So these are things that you can do with line intensity mapping, which synergizes nicely with CMB, because these are generally especially line intensity mapping like CO and C+, they are operating between about 30 gigahertz and 2 terahertz in terms of the technology or the frequency range, which is the same as what the CMB generally will be operating at. So there's potentially synergies for observing both of these. So just to summarize that beginning bit, it's just to say, yes, having your CMB, keeping in mind your ancillary science for your CMB mission just involves larger communities. It makes sure you get a trickle of papers all the way through, and you actually can get more publications than maybe your main science target will give you. So it's a plus all around. And the main point that I just want to hammer home again is that when you're designing your CMB mission or your line intensity mapping mission, keep in mind the fact that it potentially, because the technologies overlap and the analysis overlaps, you could do synergistic surveys, and those sort of things definitely help when you're building a big, $1 billion space mission. If you can find a way of bringing in a whole extra community, then that's just going to look great for funders, right? So now I just want to talk a bit about some of the science that I've done with some of these experiments. So this is CBAS. So CBAS stands for the C-band all-sky survey. This top panel shows the Owens Valley Radio Observatory, which is in California in the US. You can see the CBAS dish here in the foreground. This is a 6.1 meter dish. And in the bottom image, we have the equivalent in the south, which is in the Karoo National Park in South Africa, actually on like the SK site. This is an disused telecommunications dish that we're reusing for CBAS, which is about a 7 meter dish. Now, currently, we only have the northern survey completed. The southern survey is still waiting to be fully finished. But the key thing about CBAS, what makes it special, is so it's this 5 gigahertz survey of the, I hope eventually will be of the whole sky, but at the moment of the northern hemisphere, that has about a 1 degree resolution, and critically is measuring I, Q, and U Stokes parameters. So it can be used. The intention is for it to be used as a way of accurately subtracting out polarized synchrotron emission for both current and future polarized CMB missions. So this is what the CBAS data looks like. So this is total intensity. So I, Stokes I. And this is one of the most sensitive, high quality maps of total intensity available today. This map, unlike, for example, the other equivalent to this would be the 408 megahertz Haslam map. But unlike the Haslam map, we've done everything we can to make the CBAS mission comparable to the control and systematics that you would want from a CMB mission. So we've taken a lot of care to make sure that the beam is well controlled. So if you can see that this is the dish, this 6.1 meter dish, for example, to make sure we have a completely symmetrized beam, you can see here that this is the secondary reflector. This is the primary reflector, the big dish at the back. But the secondary reflector, instead of being held by spokes, is actually being suspended in a microwave transparent foam, so that you don't get the diffraction patterns essentially of the spokes that would be holding up the secondary. That gives us a symmetrized beam that we understand well. There is no ellipticity to the beam, and the things like polarization leakage are very tiny as well. So it just gives us this huge control on this beam systematics, which is critical. We've also been extremely careful in terms of how we've observed the sky so that we can carefully remove terrestrial signals, both from human man-made interference, radio frequency interference, and also from ground pickup. So this map is also confusion noise limited, as opposed to being receiver noise limited. So every pixel on here at the beam scale is many times, orders of magnitude times in terms of like the sigma detection of any given signal. And it's actually limited by, so as I say, it's limited by confusion noise, not by the receiver noise. And that means that actually the background galaxies, radio galaxies, all mixing together, having this sort of uniform random distribution on the sky, all of those together are what are actually limiting the sensitivity of this map. So this is basically as good as you can possibly get at 1 degree scales. If we then look at that in polarization, so this is the polarization data. So this is slightly saturated. So because I'm trying to highlight all of the structures I can. But what you can see here is I've overplotted using these line integral convolution functions, the orientation of the galactic magnetic field by rotating the polarization vectors of the polarized emission. So what we can see here is we can see some similar features to what we see in intensity. For example, this feature in the center of the map is the North Polar Spur. We can see over here on the left this diffuse haze. This is the fan region. All the sort of the background emission as well that we can see, there are all sorts of loops and spurs, which I'll go into a little bit of detail on a couple of those in a second. But all of this emission everywhere on the sky here, this is actually at a 5 sigma or better detection on any given part of the sky per beam, per CBAS beam. So this is sort of the premier, the best all sky or northern sky polarization map that is currently available. Now, one thing that you might notice as well is here in the center. So if you think, let me go back. So you have the galactic plane here in the center. This is the inner galactic plane. This is the Cygnus region, and so we go to here, this is then just the inner plane. All of this region looks a bit strange in polarized intensity, and this is because of Faraday depolarization. So what that is as polarized light propagates through the magneto-ionic medium, which is just ionized gas with the galactic magnetic field passing through it, it undergoes Faraday rotation, and the stronger the magnetic field and the denser the ionic medium, the faster that rotation occurs. So right near the galactic plane, there's so much ionized gas, the magnetic fields are sufficiently strong, but it's mostly because there's more ionic gas, more plasma, that you end up rotating the polarized light so much within the bandwidth of CBAS that you end up getting it depolarized. Or you get a mixture of two very different polarizations mixing, or multiple very different polarizations mixing within the large beam, the 1 degree beam of CBAS. So you end up with these depolarization canals and structures where the galactic plane would be. But the reason why we picked 5 gigahertz for CBAS is that effect of depolarization due to Faraday rotation is actually very small outside of this very inner part of the galaxy. Most of the sky, we actually only have about a 5 degree rotation in terms of angle rotation for things like this, the North Pole Spur, or these background features, or for the fan region. All of these have very, very little Faraday rotation that's occurring, which gives this an advantage over some of the other lower frequency surveys, polarized surveys such as SPAS or Stocker DRAO maps, where a huge part of the sky becomes depolarized, because as you go to lower frequencies, that Faraday rotation effect becomes more prominent. So talking of Faraday rotation, this is one thing that we can do now with CBAS in combination with SPAS, is we can start doing these Faraday rotation maps with the radio data. So this is something that has been done, Faraday rotation maps, where we've basically taken, Faraday rotation is defined here for being proportional to your line of sight magnetic field and your ionized gas density along a line of sight. But you can calculate the Faraday rotation, or rotation measure, as it's written here in this equation, by essentially taking the angles of your Q and U maps, so that your Q and U Stokes parameters maps are proportional to the polarized intensity with the cosine or sine of twice the polarization angle of the emission that you're measuring. And this is the angle that is rotating as the radiation passes through the magneto-ionic medium. So we can compare CBAS with higher frequency surveys where rotation measures, the effect of Faraday rotation is much less. So we can compare, if we compare the angles, so this is the angles from CBAS to the angles measured by Planck and WMAP, and then we are able to calculate just using a simple linear fit, and there are some assumptions of Faraday thin regimes and things, but without going into details, you can just do this linear fit, which lets you calculate the rotation measure at any point of the sky just using radio data. So this is something that hasn't really been possible before, because you need high sensitivity, polarized, low frequency radio surveys to do this, to compare with Planck. And so this is the map that we get. This is something that we're working on and hoping to publish this result in the next few months. But this rotation measure map is driven primarily by just the radio data. And we can compare this to surveys of rotation measures that have been done by surveys of extragalactic polarized radio sources that they measure, for example, the total integrated line of sight Faraday rotation through the whole galaxy, whereas radio emission experiments like CBAS and Planck, the emission that we're measuring is the synchrotron radiation, and so we don't measure the full Faraday depth essentially of our galaxy. We measure just whatever the depth, the magneto-ionic medium that is in front of the synchrotron emission that we're measuring. If you can visualize that. So essentially, synchrotron radiation is just nearer, so there's less material that the light is passing through. And extragalactic galaxies are obviously outside of our galaxy, so they're passing through the whole of the galaxy. And by doing that, we can even start getting ideas of like distances to, or make arguments of distances to different synchrotron features that we see on the sky by looking at what fraction of Faraday rotation do we see within features within synchrotron features on the sky. So in general, what we find is it's only about 50% of what we see of the total integrated galaxy Faraday depth is what we see for the synchrotron emission, which we think makes quite a lot of sense because we think a lot of the synchrotron loops, especially at high latitudes, are quite nearby. And the fan region is also likely to be very nearby, probably only 3 kiloparsecs, but in the next arm over from us in the galaxy. So that's something that we're working on. We also were working on using the CBAS map to measure the galactic magnetic field turbulence or compare it to different galactic magnetic field models. So what we've done here is we've taken angles, so this angle map on the bottom left. And what we've done is we've looked, so this is the black regions of the pixels that we're using on this map on the bottom left. And what we've done is we've measured the difference in the angle between 2 pixels on the sky, and we've measured the RMS, the average RMS or variance for all the for every pixel for a certain separation between pixels on the sky. So certain angular distances, we're looking for like what is the correlation between angles in the sky, because we want to know are they coherent structures, and we can then compare that to magnetic field models to see if they predict the same coherent structures, is the idea. So this gray line at the top, which is slightly blocked by this subplot, but this gray line at the top is showing if the whole sky was just random angles, you would end up with this about 37-degree RMS. So totally random angles has this flat line at the top. What we see with CBAS is this black line with the stars, which you can see is far less than the completely random line. So the lower the RMS here, the more coherent the structures are on those scales, right? So if it was 0, if everywhere was 0, then you would basically have everything would be correlated with everything else. And then we have these different field models where there are, for magnetic field models, for example, these ones with the dot dash lines are models that include not just the coherent large scale structure magnetic field, but also the turbulent component, which you can see generally randomizes the magnetic field, reduces the correlation, so it approaches the random line. But generally, depending on the model that we use, that there is this, is either overshooting or undershooting the RMS that we're seeing from CBAS in the real data. But if we don't include a turbulent component, we see that we undershoot by a long way. So all these solid lines don't include any turbulent component. They just contain just the correlated broad large scale galactic magnetic field models. So this is quite interesting. This is something that we're looking into at the moment. So we can see that CBAS is essentially saying that the magnetic field models that we have at the moment maybe aren't completely recreating what we see in terms of the real data. And there's some finessing in terms of maybe the exact structure of the models, but also the amount of turbulence that we need to inject into these models to make them work. So I think I'm a little bit lower on time than I was expecting for this point. So I'm just going to skip past. So this is just a little menagerie of zoom-ins of just features that we can see. But I want to talk a little bit about COMAP as well. So I'm just going to flash through these. But basically, the point of these slides is that we see, because we have such high signal to noise, we are seeing all these new features. And we've got a paper that will be coming out again in just a few months, hopefully, that is going to go through all the details of these new features and new loops and new spurs that we found in the polarization data of CBAS. Yes, so this is COMAP. So COMAP is like I said, it's an intensity mapping experiment. It's a line intensity mapping experiment. COMAP stands for the CO Mapping Array Project, and this is the Pathfinder telescope, which is a 10.4-meter dish at the Owens Valley Radio Observatory. So very near to where CBAS was. And this is actually a recycled KARMA dish, which was an interferometer over just outside of Owens Valley. It was up in the mountains towards Death Valley. So in terms of science, they are observing around redshifts of 3. This is an ongoing project. But in terms of what I'm interested in is using this for galactic science, we have the key thing is that it's observing between 26 and 34 gigahertz, and it has an angular resolution of 4.5 arc minutes. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because makes it the almost perfect experiment for studying anomalous microwave emission, because it has the frequency range is peaking is around 30 gigahertz, which is where anomalous microwave emission peaks, is probably the primary component of the galaxy at those frequencies and in total intensity. And 4.5 arc minute resolution means that we can start resolving individual H2 clouds, H2 regions, dust clouds, etc., that weren't possible with 30 gigahertz data that was available previously, for example, from Planck, which was operating at more like a degree resolution. So this is the survey that we have so far. So we have multiple bands. We have 4 bands that we averaged the spectrometer data of COMAP down to. So here we have the 27 gigahertz map. So this is what we had back in 2023. Well, actually, this is the same patch of sky that we were showing in the Thomas Rennie 2023 paper, where we first talked about COMAP's galactic plane survey, which is a survey which we're using the COMAP telescope to map the continuum emission at between 26 and 34 gigahertz for all of the Northern Hemisphere's galactic plane. So from about 20 degrees longitude to roughly 270 degrees longitude. And currently we have mapped from 20 to about 150. At the time of 2023, this was the patch that we covered, so about 20 degrees, so from 20 to 40 degrees in longitude and plus or minus 1.5 degrees in latitude. This is actually an improved version of the map that was shown in that original paper. It's actually improved. The sensitivity of this map is probably about a factor of 2 or better, depending on which patch of the sky you're looking at, 2 or better than what was discussed in that paper, because we found a new way of processing or analyzing data that massively improved the noise by stabilizing the gain fluctuations of the receivers. But yeah, what you can see here, if you compare it to the best alternative at 30 gigahertz, which comes from Planck, you can see that Planck is basically this very blurry approximation of the galactic plane, which let us understand many things about anomalous microwave emission. But now we can look a lot deeper at individual objects. You can see that there are all sorts of all these larger structures that have all sorts of different substructures to do with for example, if we zoom in here on the left, this is W44. This is a supernova remnant that's sort of in the snowplow era of the supernova explosion, where it's about 30,000 years old. And this is mostly synchrotron radiation. But we can then also see that there's all these other clouds here, which if we compare with Spitzer, all these structures that we see along the galactic plane highly correlate with the mid-infrared, and to some extent with free, but much more correlated with the mid-infrared, highly implying that a lot of the emission that we're seeing at 30 gigahertz at these resolutions really is all to do with anomalous microwave emission, especially from individual objects, but also from the diffuse emission around individual objects. So most of the individual point sources that we see are actually H2 regions, so ionized gas associated with an OB star or OB star type cluster. And these are all just star-forming regions. So this is W43, this is W41. These are just big star-forming regions that we can see in a lot more detail. Like I said, we've observed a lot more now. Here's just a couple of cuts that I did. So these are going on an extra 20 degrees. These are slightly less well processed than the previous map, so there are some systematic. So please excuse those. These aren't final maps just yet. But what I want to highlight is just all these different structures that we're seeing, all these clouds, because COMAP is a total intensity single dish experiment. We are seeing not just the power from point sources, we're seeing the extended emission, which is really critical for anomalous microwave emission because we think it is mostly within the extended component of the galaxy. This is just a new region which we've just recently started observing, which is the Cygnus region. It's a little bit noisier, there's a little bit less data there yet, but I was quite excited. This is something that's sort of hot off the press, so I just thought I'd stick this in here. And then I'm very low on time, so I'm just going to talk about a recent paper just that highlighted the results from COMAP and the power of COMAP. So this is Barnard 30. This is an anomalous microwave emitting region that was identified by Planck in 2015. It's a part of a larger dust ring around a star called Lambda-Orionis. Now, Lambda-Orionis is an O-type star that is ionizing a spherical region of ionized gas around it, and as it pushes out that ionized gas, it's sweeping up dust in the interstellar medium, and that dust in projection ends up looking like a ring. And we found in 2015 that there was a part of the ring that was particularly bright at 30 gigahertz at 1 degree resolution, but it was very hard to disentangle it from the diffuse free emission, the ionized gas, because they were so mixed at 1 degree resolutions. And it's also hard to decouple it, the dust, for different traces of dust in terms of thermal dust and mid-infrared dust. Everything just looks the same at 1 degree. So when you then look at 4.5 arc minutes, which we are here, and then compare it to these maps on the left, so the COMAP maps are these two maps here. And as you go through different dust maps, so this is the ACT 98 gigahertz, these all the way up to the Planck 857, this is tracing thermal dust. And then we go into the far infrared with IRAS, and then the mid-infrared and near-infrared with WISE. We can see, and low frequencies down here, we can see GALFAX. So these are all tracing dust, but then in the low frequencies with GALFAX and GB6 and H-alpha, these are tracing the free emission. And what we can do with COMAP, we can see with the resolution that we have that we are clearly not correlating with the structures seen in the free emission. So we can see and also estimate and separate out the free emission very easily from what we see at 30 gigahertz, leaving us with a very pure signal of the dust. But what's even more interesting is that at this resolution that we are able now to start seeing that anomalous microwave emission does not correlate with all dust tracers equally well, which you do see at 1 degree resolution. What we see is that actually sub-millimeter tracers of dust, which are basically tracing the total dust column proportional to the total dust column, actually is not the most effective tracer. And the reason for that is that, for example, there is a cold core here that we just do not see an equivalent structure at 30 gigahertz. If anomalous microwave emission was purely because of the dust column, we would expect to see a similar peak at 30 gigahertz, but we don't. And the fact that we don't tells us that anomalous microwave emission is very much dependent on the environment as well. Now we see that the correlations do increase with mid-infrared. So if you can just by eye, we quantify this numerically in the paper, but by eye you can see that the correlations are much stronger between the mid-infrared and far infrared with the 30 gigahertz data. And we think what's going on, one of the conclusions here is in the cold cores, you actually get dust coagulation, which ends up increasing the size of the dust grains such that they can no longer spin up effectively to the 30 gigahertz peak emission that is required for spinning dust emission. Anyway, this is the sort of cool, interesting new science that we can start doing with this sort of resolution and frequencies with COMAP. And I think I'll just end there. So yeah, so the conclusions are we make sure when you're designing your CMB missions, you have other ancillary science in mind, and maybe even synergizing with line intensity mapping experiments, because that just brings in so much more of the community. It just makes so much more of an impact for your experiment overall. CBAS is the premier, the best northern sky survey of synchrotron, polarized synchrotron radiation. That should be out within the next year for the public so the wider community to be able to use. And finally, COMAP, that we have this galactic plane survey at 30 gigahertz of 4.5 arc minutes that should be mapping all the observable northern galactic plane in total power and at single dish. So we'll be able to look at all these beautiful diffuse quiescent clouds that are emitting at 30 gigahertz. And again, eventually, once we've completed that probably in a couple of years, that will be released to the public as well. And thank you. I'll stop there. Sorry, I think I ran over a little bit. Hopefully not too much.
Thank you, Stuart. It's a nice talk. If anybody has any question, you can mute yourself and ask. Okay, I can see one question in chat. So the question is, can we develop some mathematical model or deep learning algorithm to mimic foreground 21 centimeter signal highly affected by the foregrounds?
I mean, so I personally, I've not worked in doing something like that. But funny you should ask that. I think there was literally a paper on Archive yesterday where some people were doing exactly that. And there are people who are working on using moment expansion type techniques to be able to recreate foregrounds rapidly, and then also be able to that is the sort of technique that probably would lend itself very nicely to sort of a deep learning type algorithm, because it sort of simplifies the foregrounds into just spectral components that have less parameters that are needed, that not necessarily fully physically motivated, so that they can be quickly learned. So yeah, I mean, definitely there are techniques for using deep learning to both study and also produce simulated versions of these sort of these foregrounds. I don't think there's like a widely adopted suite of tools, but like I said, there was a paper literally on Archive yesterday. I can't remember the title of the paper, but if you have a look at Thursday's release, there's definitely a paper that was talking about exactly this thing.
Good. Okay, so I have one question. So somewhere you mentioned mapping of 3D galactic magnetic field using Faraday rotation and combining the different surface data. Can you be more elaborate on that?
Yeah, so this is a very difficult thing. That this is I think yeah. I think I was talking about it in one of the early slides, right? So yeah, so this is sort of like the holy grail of galactic magnetic field science, is to bring together every data set that we have available, and that there are collaborations sort of like I believe it's Imagine is the name of a collaboration that's working on this, where they want to take all the available data sets, so the dust polarization and synchrotron polarization, which are measuring the perpendicular components of the magnetic field, combine that with Faraday rotation maps, such as this one at the bottom, and also the radio one, which I showed later on in the talk, to measure the line of sight magnetic field. But then also there are experiments like GMIMS and STAPS, which are measuring spectrally, I believe between 1300 and 1800 megahertz. They're spectrally measuring galactic synchrotron emission to do things like Faraday synthesis measurements, which is where you essentially you can map out structures along the line of sight that are due to Faraday rotation, allowing you to map out distances and actual clouds and individual clouds in theory, as and combining that with these higher frequency data sets and external galaxy data sets. In theory, you have all the components. You have every component that's needed to start mapping out the 3D galactic the 3D structure of the galactic magnetic field. But the challenges there are understanding the data in sufficient detail to be able to do that accurately. For example, like these Faraday synthesis data, they have incomplete spectra. So Fourier transforms of spectra that are incomplete mean you have to have all sorts of windowing functions, so that limits what you can do. Knowing distances to structures in these maps means things become more difficult. So for example, we don't know the distances to all the dust structures. We have optical optical absorption data. We can use Gaia, for example, to build these 3D dust maps that we can start having. So that sort of improves that. So we can maybe start associating certain polarization structures with certain distances. In the future, we're going to have experiments like Pacify, which is going to be using optical starlight absorption, mapping polarized starlight absorption to do 3D polarization maps as well. So there's all these experiments and these things that are all coming together that hopefully, yeah, they're all clues to building this big 3D model of the galaxy. And these are just components of it. And what I was saying with this slide is like that's like an ultimate goal of some of these larger collaborations. We're not, and we've just got hints essentially of what that structure is at the moment.
Thanks. Fazlu, you had some question?
Yeah, so I don't know if there is enough time, or maybe I can have a quick question. Yeah, so whatever, hi Stuart, thanks for nice talk. It's Fazlu here. So what I want to ask is, it's that, okay, why are we fixing the beam size to be like 1 degree for CBAS? Or in other words, like, what is the thing that stops us from not having a arc minute or maybe arc second all sky radio survey, something like the COMAP, which you're looking at arc minute resolution, but only in the galactic plane. So why don't we have a all sky equivalent of that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a very reasonable question. I mean, so the trouble with that is that, of course, there are physical limitations, right? You have the diffraction of your, the diffraction of your optics is what's limiting you. So you've got the size of your dish. The bigger your dish is, the higher the resolution you can go. And the higher in frequency you are, also the higher resolution you can achieve with a given dish size. So with CBAS, we're already using a 6.1 meter telescope. And to get down to arc minute resolutions, we would literally need to have it be comparable, for example, to the resolution of COMAP. We would need a 10 times, it's literally linearly scaling. It's like we need a 10 times bigger dish to be able to do that. So we'd need a 60-meter dish, which would mean we'd have to be working with one of these really big general purpose telescopes like the Effelsberg or GBT or Parkes. But then when you are trying to map very large areas of the sky with these high resolution instruments, it means that the amount of time, the number of beams on the sky becomes larger, right? So when you have 1 degree resolution, you've got something like, for the northern sky, you've got something like 28,000 beams, individual beams on the sky that you need to measure. So the pointings that you need to integrate to the sensitivity to be able to measure things to the quality that we need is going to be much less, or it's going to be literally 10 times, well, 10 times less than what you need. Or actually, in terms of noise, it could be even 100 times less than what you would need for a 10 times higher resolution instrument, which would have 10 times more beams on the sky that you need to measure.
Okay,
thank you. Yeah, so it's just a practical problem, basically.
Yes.
It's also the reason why we don't have space-based radio experiments, right? Because we are limited by 1 meter size dishes, really, or that we can have on space-based missions. And if you only have a 1 meter dish, then the resolution is going to be not good enough, basically, to be usable with the rest of the instrumentation.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. If not, let's thank Stuart, and thank you all for joining.
Okay, thank you everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.